Hey everybody, welcome to another exciting webinar. My name is Jack Fruh, and today we've got some awesome speakers with us for SharePoint No Code Solutions. If you guys aren't already familiar with the folks on the panel today, we've got Marc Anderson, and Marc wants to make sure that you all know that his name is spelled with a C and not a K. We also have Ira Fuchs, and Ira's going to be getting a Twitter account any minute now, so we're just waiting until that catches on for him. And then one of my favorite SharePoint people of all time, Asif Rehmani. If you've never seen him speak before, then you're really missing out. Asif is, to me, he's the go-to no-code solutions guy. I mean, he's been doing no-code solutions like before it was the in thing, right? And he's just got so much knowledge in this area. I think it's an honor to have all three of these guys on our panel today, right? So a little bit of housekeeping, just so you know where the exits are and all that kind of stuff. This session is brought to you by Visual SP. If you're not familiar with Visual SP, I just want to show you quickly their website. Visual SP used to be known as SharePoint Videos. In fact, the URL is the same. And they now have two services that they offer. One is the SharePoint Video Training, which is a great value. I think it's like $20 a month, and it has tons and tons of user videos and what have you. But the other thing I think is really neat what they've done is they've bundled a lot of the training into a help system that gets integrated right into the SharePoint ribbon and makes all this video content available for end users. It's just a wonderful solution if you've got a bigger organization and don't have the ability to reach every single one of your people, but still want to provide quality training to them. So just a plug for SharePoint Videos and for Visual SP. We really appreciate them sponsoring the webinar today. So thank you so much for that. Lastly, at the end of this webinar, we're going to give away a 1-year subscription to SharePoint Videos, to the training side that we just talked about. It's almost a $200 value, and we're going to pick the winner at random out of people that have asked questions in the Q&A board. So if on your GoToWebinar, if you go in there and ask questions, that will make you eligible for the drawing at the end, and we'll pick a name and we'll announce that before the webinar is over, and then we'll email the codes and stuff afterwards. When the webinar is done, we're gonna have a recording of it. It'll be available at SharePointVideos.com, and I think that's it. So to get this started, we've got a couple of questions I think right now that had been sent in before. Let me go through a couple of these, and then we'll see if any of our panelists want to kind of step in here. First question is, which tools in SharePoint can be used to create quick and easy solutions? And I assume that we're talking about which out-of-the-box tools, right? So do you have any thoughts there? Maybe Asif can answer this one.
I'm sure we all have a lot to pipe in that question. It's a pretty loaded question, actually, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as far as tools are concerned, since the beginning, there's been always some tools outside of the SharePoint browser that you could use, but not go as far as doing coding within Visual Studio. And as for many people on this webinar already know, those have been SharePoint Designer, InfoPath, which, by the way, I know we need to get into InfoPath. There's been many questions that have come in regarding InfoPath's past, current, and future. But in addition to that, there's also a Dashboard Designer, there's Report Designer, there's even Office tools like Access and Word. Those things can also be utilized as quote-unquote no-code tools to build solutions on top of SharePoint.
Yeah, I think that the other thing to note here is that just using SharePoint out of the box gives you far more tools than most people ever take advantage of. So using some intelligently using some of the out-of-the-box capabilities that SharePoint gives you, like content types and some of the basic workflows and things, actually lets you go a lot further than most people realize. I think a lot of conversations end up going to developers right away, and if you actually take a step back, read some books, and understand what SharePoint does for you itself, you may not need to write any code.
Yeah, workflows are really pretty amazing, especially the newest version, 2013. The things that you can do with workflows are pretty awesome. Interestingly enough, SharePoint Designer, a tool that a lot of people have kind of feared for a long time, they've moved the focus away from page design, but then they've shored up a lot of the workflow functionality to where that's actually a reasonably good tool right now that I think the average end user could easily use to do some like you said, something that would have been considered programming 5 years ago is configuration now.
And SharePoint Designer also is the tool of choice for anybody who is responsible for working with SharePoint artifacts, site collection, sites, lists, libraries, content type, web parts, it provides a much more efficient and elegant way of working, managing, creating all of those artifacts far more effectively than using the SharePoint user interface. So, you know, if you are a power user or you are a SharePoint administrator, you want to be living in SharePoint Designer.
And just you know, for those on the audience, if you don't already know, SharePoint Designer is totally free now. You know, once upon a time, it used to be called Front Page. They used to charge for it. Then it was SharePoint Designer, and they charged for it. Then it was SharePoint Designer, and it was the same one, but it was free. Well, it's free still today. The other thing, if you're on the management side, if you run a SharePoint farm and you're a little bit leery of letting SharePoint Designer loose, you might have heard people say that, oh, SharePoint Designer, people can totally mess up their sites and things like that. In the latest versions of SharePoint, like 2013, for example, there's a lot of granularity now that you can apply to say, well, somebody can use SharePoint Designer, but they can't use it to break a site from its definition and things like that. So it probably is not. I think that some of the early warnings about using SharePoint Designer were true, but I don't know that they're true anymore. I think it's an area where that has, that Microsoft's done a good job of kind of responding to users and making it so that it's a tool that people can use for the right reasons.
And Jack, limiting that was also in SharePoint 2010. So either at the farm level in central administration or at the site collection level, you can go into the settings and you can restrict the functionality that typically created problems for people, like detaching master pages, changing page layouts. You can deselect that functionality so people can only work with the really useful stuff in SharePoint Designer and not access the stuff that created problems back in 2007.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems with SharePoint Designer all along has been this sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater problem. Somebody does something stupid, they delete the master page or whatever it is, and the sort of knee-jerk reaction is, let's turn off that tool then. And there's so many things you can do with SharePoint Designer just by sort of point and click kind of methods without writing any code whatsoever, that turning it off altogether is really a very short-sighted thing. The capabilities are so strong that you really don't want to make the mistake of just saying, well, somebody did something bad once, so we're going to turn it off.
Sure. Hey, Marc and Ira and Asif, I'm just looking at some of the questions coming through the chat room here, and it looks like, let's take a look here. Manish had a question about jQuery. Kevin had a question about jQuery. Anne-Marie had a question about whether these things, if you use them, would they need to be addressed during an upgrade and stuff like that. I thought this might be a good time, since this is the No Code Solution webinar, to talk about where is that fine line, right? Because with things like jQuery, you can put some code in a system almost as a user, right, in a content editor web part without having access to the server. So what do you guys feel is the general, what's the line in the sand? What counts as code and what doesn't?
Marc and I were discussing this earlier, so we have a little bit of different interpretations for that, and I think that's perfectly okay to have different interpretation of what's code and what's not code. My interpretation is that if you have something that's managed, that's compiled, then it's code. If it's semicolons, JavaScript, VBScript, CSS, HTML, that to me is not, I mean, of course it's code in general meaning of thing, but when you talk about super users and power users being the ability of what they could do, I believe they should be able to do those things just fine without getting into the compiled code methodology. That's
right. And I don't think we disagree, Asif. It's more that I see it as a spectrum. There are users who go and grab a little snippet of code, like from my SP services library, drop it into a content editor web part, and it just works. They're not coding per se. They're changing some values to configure something. So they're not actually writing code, but it's code behind it. It's JavaScript. Well, our definition of code there is different, but it's writing. It's not really writing code. It's just dropping some code in, and then you can go a little further, and you can start to write your own JavaScript that does some interesting things before you go and talk to the people who have Visual Studio on their machines. So it's really a spectrum. We used to get into all kinds of arguments about whether or not JavaScript is code, and I think that those arguments are sort of a waste of time. if you're telling a machine how to do something for you, then you're probably coding-ish, or you're clicking on buttons in the UI, or you're doing something that's useful so that you can meet your business requirements. And just understanding which of those tools you want to use at any given time based on what those requirements are is the really important thing.
Sure. Hey, I have a question from Lisa in the chat room here. Lisa says, how does Office 365 and SharePoint Online impact no-code solutions? And I think that there's a pretty big topic there. Do you guys want to chat on that? Not everybody all at once.
So,
well,
you can
go ahead, Ira.
Use SharePoint Designer with Office 365 and SharePoint, and any of the functionality that would be applicable to an online will work in SharePoint. I mean, on-premise will work online, so you have full parity there with functionality in SharePoint Designer. Marc, I'll let you take over on that.
Well, I think it's sort of an interesting shift, because as SharePoint in Office 365 sort of is becoming subsumed by what Office 365 is growing up to be, and I don't see that as a bad thing. That SharePoint word may go away, that's fine. But as it's sort of subsumed into Office 365, the ways that we can build things is changing. And I think on some levels we need developers more with Office 365 than we do on premises. And the reason I say that is that the newer ways of building things with the app model and things like that actually are, I think, a little bit more, even more developer intensive sometimes than building things with full trust code was on premises. So we're going through some interesting evolution. It would be great if there was more sort of point-and-click configuration stuff coming with Office 365, and we do see that with such experiences as Delve and the new video portal and things like that. But we still want SharePoint itself, the thing that's still inside Office 365, to get easier to use so you don't need developers. And I don't see a lot of that going on.
Right, and you should be aware that with the next full release of SharePoint for on-premise, SharePoint 2015, which will probably happen towards the end of this year, that InfoPath will disappear from the online version entirely.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Is that true? I haven't heard that. That's interesting.
Well, so here's the thing: is if you go in and you look at all of the fine print that they've always said about on-premise and online. So on-premise, the application lifecycle management support for all of Microsoft products are 10 years. So on-premise, SharePoint will be supported up until 2023. But if you go and play some of the videos and look at the documentation around the online, online is still, you have SharePoint 2000, InfoPath 2013. But if you, again, read the fine print, they say with the next version of the full version of SharePoint, on the online version, InfoPath will probably disappear.
Interesting.
I know they very much want to get rid of it because it's an operational headache for them.
Yeah, I think that the really, I keep using the word interesting because I don't know any other polite words I can use, but a lot of people are using InfoPath with Office 365, so it will be interesting to see what that path turns into. I mean, it can't work in such a way that InfoPath just stops working. Well, I think it's way too powerful a tool.
It just won't be.
Yeah, since we can't control what updates we get on Office 365 to a large degree, something's going to have to give there. Well, we'll see. We'll have to watch the Office blogs and things like that to see where they're headed with it.
So, that's pretty interesting. We have a couple of questions about SharePoint Designer, and specifically, one person asked a question about what are the new features in 2013 SharePoint Designer that may be noteworthy that people wouldn't know about. Another person asked a question about the lack of design view in 2013, and is there an alternative, and what's the recommendation there? Best practices in that regard. What are the thoughts, guys?
Well, Yeah, go ahead. You go ahead, Marc.
We started with exactly the same sentence. Interesting. Well, the design view is absolutely not there, and unfortunately, SharePoint Designer is really the only developer tool that is fully aware of SharePoint. And I know that somebody might argue that Visual Studio is too, but there's no WYSIWYG kind of option there. So we've lost the only design view that we really had into SharePoint Pages, and there is no replacement for that. We can use other editors for things like HTML, but most of those editors, like Dreamweaver, like Sublime Text, which I use a lot, like I use WebStorm as well, they don't understand any of the SharePoint tags, so they can't be a WYSIWYG environment for us, because ASPX pages with SharePoint tags are not understandable by any other editor other than SharePoint Designer. So we've essentially gone blind. We can't see the design view, and we don't have any option to replace it, which is incredibly unfortunate, but makes some sense given that the sort of the trend and way we're going to be interacting with SharePoint over time, especially as you start to think about the app model, is through JavaScript and API calls. We're really going to be looking at SharePoint as a service, so the design view in a way is less and less important, but I miss it as much as everyone else does. I used to do a lot of work with it.
And you can actually use InfoPath to point to any list or library and generate a pseudo view of either all of the repeating items or one or more items at a time, and create, what I call a pseudo view using InfoPath.
Interesting.
Now, and I almost feel like that's a double-edged sword, given that we just talked about InfoPath going away.
It is a double-edged sword because you're getting screwed both ways.
Hey, on the designer side, we were a couple of questions coming through about designer. One person, looks like Nadine, asked, if you're new to SharePoint 2013, what are some things you can do with workflows? I might be more inclined to use than SharePoint Designer to begin. So do we want to just talk real quick, what is a workflow? Maybe people don't even really understand what that is. Anybody want to take the lead on that? If not, I can start.
Go for it, Jack.
All right. So in SharePoint, workflows are a way that lets you set up a step of actions that are going to happen. Sometimes they're going to happen on their own, like after, let's say, a period of time, and sometimes they're going to happen for example, in response to something, right? So a very common workflow, let's just say a vacation request workflow, right? Somebody puts in a request for a vacation, and they do that by adding, for example, an item to a calendar in SharePoint, right? What's going to happen then is if the workflow is set up, that might email somebody like their boss to approve it. The boss is going to get an email, and they might or might not do something with it. So part of the workflow might be that if nothing happens after 24 hours, it's going to send a reminder email, right? Now, let's say the boss goes in and they say, I approve this, it's okay. The workflow engine will take that approval and then move the status of the list item, for example, from unapproved to approved, and maybe it will then send an email back to that user, right? So there's a whole step of kind of little actions. And in the old days, that would have all been done through custom programming, right? Today, what we have available to us is there are some what we call out-of-the-box workflows. And what we mean by out-of-the-box is we mean that you don't even need SharePoint Designer for this. There are some workflows that do very basic approval things that are already built into SharePoint, right? You don't even need Designer. If you need more than what the out-of-the-box ones do, that's when you would bring in something like SharePoint Designer, and that's where SharePoint Designer 2013 really shines, because they really improved some of the workflow functionality, which in all fairness, it's always been a good tool, but it really wasn't that great of a tool until 2013 as it relates to workflows, right? So now you can do things, for example, you couldn't copy and paste workflow steps in SharePoint Designer 2010, but you can in 2013. So like, to me, that's pretty basic, and I'm glad it's there now, but it should have been there before. But there's looping, there's all sorts of stuff. So you can do a lot of kind of stuff. And the neat thing is that I think you don't even really need to be a programmer, I think, to take this stuff on, right? I mean, most of the time people are approaching programming, they're really approaching it from a business perspective anyway. I want this to happen when this happens, right? Well, from a business perspective, you just define the programming logic that a programmer would have used, right? If you can go into SharePoint Designer and do that yourself, you might be able to get a lot more done than you would if you had to hire a consultant and you didn't have the money, those kinds of things, right? So I think Designer is a great thing. So
I think the hardest thing with workflows is actually not sort of building the workflow itself. It's understanding what the workflow really is. Well, we give it to Betty, and then sometimes she puts it in her drawer, and other times she walks it down the hall, but we really only know that if Steve tells us. You get into these very interesting conversations where people realize they don't actually have a workflow.
Yeah.
But that's the stuff that you're trying to automate, and it only automates well if it's a well understood process, something that's repeatable and understandable.
On the same line, somebody from the audience asked, what about SharePoint Online? What are the limitations for workflows online? Now, as far as I know, SharePoint Designer still works great with SharePoint Online workflow. Have you guys run into anything any different?
In fact, I use, on my demos, I use SharePoint Online most of the time now with SharePoint Designer. It's much easier to do it there because the workflow manager is already deployed there for 2013 especially. Otherwise, you got to deploy it yourself on the on-premises account before you can start using it. So it's been working very well. The only issue that I've experienced personally, if something is in the queue by many different people in your organization, let's say, and well, I shouldn't say something, many things, let's say, many different tasks, your task will go right behind those tasks. And that could be sending an email or whatever else that's in the workflow. So you have no control of purging or pushing or doing anything that you could do on premises. Online, you're kind of waiting and at the mercy of the cloud or whenever things happen in the cloud.
Hey, I just want to. I was just going to say, I just want to step in here. First of all, I want to thank everybody who is on this webinar. I'm looking at the questions screen, and there are questions coming in faster than we can ask them. I think we've had something like 6 to 10 questions every minute since this thing started. So first thing I just want to say, if your question doesn't get answered today, don't take any offense to it. We're doing as much as we can to get to as many of these as we can. I've got my screen rolled up here, and you can see this is Mark's Twitter handle. Here's mine. I'm sorry. Here's Asif's. Here's mine. If we don't get something covered today, I want you to feel free to ping me. I will help people all day long, and during the webinar we're going to get to as many as we can. So if we don't answer it personally, don't feel offended. We're doing the best we can, and keep the questions coming. It is awesome to see all this great support from all you guys.
So this is Ira. I just wanted to jump in about that SharePoint 2013 workflow. One of the key differences between 2013 and 2010 workflows, creating custom ones, is that you can no longer create a workflow from a content type. And that was a major omission because, to me, it's a best practice to model the workflow from a content type because it then becomes reusable.
Hey, guys, Bonnie asked in the room, she says, are there any issues migrating a 2010 workflow to SharePoint 2010 Online? Is that even possible? Because they're kind of based on different versions, right? Online at this point is actually a little bit more advanced than SharePoint 2013. And the architecture changed a little bit, but 2013, at least on premise, has a backward compatibility mode for 2010. So do you guys know what does that story look like with SharePoint Online?
I can throw some thoughts in there. If you have a SharePoint 2010, SharePoint Designer 2010 workflow, and let's say it is reusable workflow, I'm going to assume you could package it as a WSP file, take it to SharePoint Online, and I know this is a manual process, but this is a way if you have put a lot of effort in it, this is what you could do. You could take it in the solution gallery in a site collection administration screen. From the solution gallery, when you deploy it, it becomes a feature. You can go ahead and start using that feature as a workflow within the site collection. And then once you use it, the really good thing about SharePoint 2010 workflows in SharePoint 2013, because you can, by the way, use SharePoint 2010 workflow in SharePoint 2013, you can actually copy-paste the actions and conditions and blocks in SharePoint Designer as well once you have migrated to SharePoint Designer 2013. Hope I'm not confusing people over here, but within SharePoint Designer 2013, you can modify SharePoint 2010-based workflows, and those now offer copy-paste features is what I'm trying to say, which makes it much awesome once you have migrated your workflow.
I think some of the migration tools also help with this. I think ShareGate does it. I'm sure some of the other bigger ones do it too, where you want to move components from one environment to another. It really becomes a migration activity. I've actually done this by copying the XAML file and editing the GUIDs in it. And believe me, you don't want to do that, but it works. You can. That's the brute force method. If you run out of all the other options.
All right, somebody in the it looks like I'm gonna see if I get this name right. Saritha asked, about other workflow solutions like Nintex. Is there any feeling there? Are those tools worth investigating, or is SharePoint Designer good enough these days?
Well, that depends upon your requirements. Nintex is a very good workflow engine. It's been around for a while. It's mature. It's got a nice user interface. But you really need to just evaluate what your workflow requirements are and determine if SharePoint Designer can accommodate them. And if they can, save some money. If they can't, then Nintex is a perfectly good choice.
And just so for those of you who've never heard of Nintex, in SharePoint, we have a lot of stuff that's out of the box, meaning you get it when you buy or lease SharePoint. Nintex is a third-party product, meaning they're not actually part of Microsoft, and they sell a product called Nintex Workflow. And in the SharePoint world, it's pretty well known. So if you are a SharePoint person, you've heard of it. But if you're sitting there going, "What is this Nintex thing? We don't have this." That's why Nintex is an external solution that you can buy. And I've heard good things about it. I've heard it's good.
Yeah, a lot of people swear by Nintex. I think the other thing you want to bring into your considerations for this are not just your requirements, which are obviously probably the most important thing, but also your governance model. How do you want people creating workflows? What do you want those workflow artifacts to look like? With Nintex, you get more of a sort of GUI-driven process flow. With SharePoint Designer, your interaction with workflows is a little bit different, and they get stored in a different place. So you want to understand, sort of from an overarching architecture standpoint, who's allowed to do what and when and why, and how do you want the artifacts to be stored. So there's sort of a big picture step back idea about which way you want to approach workflows. You probably don't want to be developing them in code, though some people do that as well.
Hey, on the topic of SharePoint designers, it seems to be pretty big. Carol asks if you're using SharePoint Online, can you still integrate Visio like you can with the on-premise version of 2013? And I suspect, so there's a couple things I think we're thinking here. I suspect what she's talking about is the Visio integration with SharePoint Designer that lets you do some of the workflow stuff in Visio. Is that still around? Does that still work in 2013? I would assume it does.
Well, it's been superseded by a completely editable, design palette that looks very much like Visio and is probably based upon Visio, but now it is completely interactive where you can actually create, your rules and actions, visually, and they translate into the actual rules and actions that you had to create in the editor. So that's much more mature and far better in 2013.
Awesome. Let's take a look at questions here from the audience. And again, we're getting so many of them, I can't get through all of them at once. It's probably more than I can even read in a minute here. Let's see. Is there any way to take a customized list in SharePoint 2013 and convert it to a custom content type, or is content type development the same as 2010? So that one, that's probably more on the developer side. I don't know if we have time to cover that. Does anybody know the answer to that one real quick? We can throw it out there.
It's very hard to retrofit list content into content types once you have it.
Okay.
You really want to try as much as possible to get your content types in place first, because what you'd have to do, there's some coding ways you can do it, but from a user interface perspective, once you have a bunch of items in a list, it's tough to apply a different content type to them.
All right. Srikanth asks a question. Do you know when SharePoint 2015 will be coming out? And the answer there is we have a very specific formula that relies on the outcome of Groundhog Day tied with the first sight of snow in New York during the fall season. So once we have those two pieces of information, we'll be able to give you some more concrete information on that one.
So to put it simply, no. Nobody knows.
Or maybe that. Or maybe we don't know.
No, they've said that I think they're pretty clearly saying that they're going to announce when VNecks is going to happen and what it's going to be at Ignite.
And Ignite, for those of you who don't know, is the big Microsoft conference that's coming to Chicago this summer.
So by May we should know is, I guess, the answer.
Yeah, we should have a date by May. We may not see the product by May, but we'll have a date.
It is true, though, that Microsoft has committed to doing another release of SharePoint on-premises, which would be called SharePoint 2015, 2016. We don't know what it's going to be. My guess would be SharePoint 2016.
Sure. Hey, Asif, being that this whole webinar, the title of it is No Code Solutions, we talked about SharePoint Designer. We talked a little bit about InfoPath, which is kind of iffy. What are other things that you have seen or done or like that maybe are worth showing? And what I'm thinking is, Asif, I attended a session of yours at SharePoint, at I think the SharePoint conference a couple of years ago. You showed some really neat solution where there was some like fields in Microsoft Word that people could like fill out a form in Word, and then those fields magically kind of made their way back to SharePoint and stuff like that. So I know there's like a whole category of like tools and neat things that can be done that we haven't even touched on yet. Do you have anything that you'd want the audience to know about?
At least I can verbally describe it right now, and then maybe if you have enough time, we can show some of that stuff as well. There's videos and all that stuff on the SharePointVideos.com site. So what you're talking about specifically here, I believe it's I forgot the exact wording that Microsoft uses within Word. It's quick something, some quick parts, I guess.
Quick parts.
Quick parts, right? Yeah. So you can promote the quick parts as metadata into a library that you're storing the document at. So you can be putting information within your Word document, let's say a template that you already have, and the information that you put in when you save it to the library becomes metadata for that document once it's in the library, which is extremely helpful. And many people didn't know about it, so I thought might as well show it. I'm glad it was helpful and you remember that, Jack. But in addition to Word, there's facilities in Excel with the Power Pivot that we have, a Power View. There's so many different things that you can take that visualization and that view and show that within SharePoint as well. Take advantage of the scalability of the SharePoint environment so you can show those views and that powerful information to everybody within your organization. In addition to that, you have Access. Microsoft has been really, really bullish on Access. And I don't mean only Access 2013, the actual, the FAT client. I mean more Access components. And how Access components are being utilized more and more for form technologies within SharePoint. So that's happening quite a bit. I see a lot of push from Microsoft for that. So yeah, there's many, many different things in addition to SharePoint Designer and excuse me, and InfoPath they've been digging into that are worth looking at.
I think most organizations really underuse the integration that Office gives you with SharePoint. Anything from you've touched on a bunch of them, but things like pushing content from Excel lists into SharePoint lists, or Excel tables. The graphing stuff that you can do with Access services, etc. There are a lot of ways that users can use their familiar Office desktop tools and push that content or those results into SharePoint really without any kind of coding whatsoever. It's button push kind of stuff. Export to here or link this to that. It's a real no code kind of domain where I think a lot of people end up turning to developers instead of using those capabilities, which is a shame.
This is interesting. It's a coding question that came through, but I feel like it's so relevant to our conversation. It looks like Priyanka asked, do you see SharePoint heading more towards client-side coding and away from server-side coding? And the answer for me is 100% yes. Microsoft has really completely taken away the ability to do server-side coding with SharePoint Online. And they've made it clear that they want everyone to go client side. The reason I think that ties into this webinar, though, is that there are so many things that can be done without coding, right? That people maybe aren't aware of. That I think that one of the common things that happens is people journey down a code path when maybe a workflow would have taken care of it, or maybe some other third-party tool for integration would have taken care of it, right? So there's lots of paths there. So yeah, I do see server-side coding going away, and I think that the people that are going to do great using SharePoint in, let's just say, the next 3 to 5 years are going to be people who focus on these no-code solutions, because there's in most cases there's no faster way to turn around a request for somebody than if you can do it without putting any code in at all, right? So. Good question on that one.
I think the progression of thinking as to how to solve a business problem always ought to be, can I do it through the UI? If I can't do it through the UI, I might be able to do it with some sort of scripting or sort of in SharePoint Designer kind of development. And then finally, if you can't do it there, you turn to a real code developer. So I think that the erring on doing it from the other end, which is what a lot of organizations do, means they write a lot of code they don't need, and that's a waste of time and money, frankly. And so if you can do stuff through the UI, you're always going to want to do it.
I agree. I agree 100%. Just skimming through some questions. Any of you guys have a look at the questions? Anything stand out here?
So somebody asked if you can use SharePoint Designer 2013 to modify SharePoint 2010 sites. No, you can't. You need the same version. So you can only work on SharePoint 2010 sites using SharePoint Designer 2010, and 2013 sites with SharePoint Designer 2013. The nice thing is you can install both of them on the same computer. No problem.
And they're both free. In fact, as I understand it, all the versions are now free, like even 2007, which they used to charge for.
Yeah. The only exception to that, Ira, which is something that I really like, is that I can use SharePoint Designer 2013 on SharePoint 2010 experience sites on Office 365. Yes, I still have some of those. So if anybody still has any of those, that's how that works. If you have questions about that, ping me, because that's sort of an obscure thing. But
somebody asked if they were starting anew today, would they be better off starting with 2013 or waiting for 2015? And they actually had asked about it in relation to online. So the online story, as far as I can tell, is that Microsoft is not going to ever upgrade in a way that they used to upgrade the on-premise solutions. And what used to happen is you would install SharePoint 2007 and people would get really ingrained in it. And then 2010 would come out and it wasn't an easy upgrade, right? So all of a sudden an on-premise installation, you'd have to have a project and you'd have to spend months reviewing and testing and upgrading and stuff like that. What SharePoint's doing with their online is they're updating everyone kind of slowly as they go, and that's got some good points and some bad points. But the thing is there really isn't a version of online. You almost always will have the current version or you'll have the preview version, one of the two. So when we get to the point where we're calling it SharePoint 2015 on premise, the online will already have been there, and what have you. So to answer that question, if you were thinking about going into online today, then I would go into it today. I think there's value there today. I think that value will continue to build as they build more tools into it. But I wouldn't see any reason to hold off.
In fact, what we see on Office 365 as SharePoint Online today may well be what 2015 ends up looking like.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, you've got an on-premise sort of code freeze that has to happen a certain amount of time before they start to ship it. Now, I'm probably wrong in that they're still working on it, but at some point, what you see in Office 365 is going to be very similar to what would be on premises later.
Makes sense. Which designer product is used for SharePoint Online? That is actually a great question, right? Because if we just said that the online versioning doesn't exactly match, what do we use?
2013.
2013?
Yep.
So that answers the question. Donald asked that question. Thanks, Donald. That was a good question. Appreciate that. All right, what else have we got here?
You mentioned you had a couple questions about jQuery or JavaScript, using those as ways to build things. I just thought I'd jump in there because that's sort of my thing. Those are definitely options, and to some people, those are no-code solutions. So often you can build some pretty nice stuff and drop them into a single page and sort of solve a sort of department level kind of thing. So I think of the people who do that as more the citizen developers as opposed to end users who are just sort of copying and pasting something from the web. So a lot of people who are not in the IT department took computer science courses are actually quite good developers, and that's an option. I think you always want to do that with full knowledge of your IT department, though I know that a lot of people do it to sneak around because the IT department is just saying no. So that's a whole other layer of no-code development that you have at your disposal.
And just to put up on the screen, Marc, you've actually taught a class that's available through Visual SP on using JavaScript and jQuery with SharePoint, right? I think that's what I'm looking at here. So,
that's me.
Yep, there's Marc, and Marc with a C. Just remember that. And there's his course. And then Ira's also done a course that's available online too. If you guys are interested, this is his course. It's just to give you some different things to look at on the screen. I feel like I need like an iTunes screensaver or some kind of mysterious clouds or something going on while we talk, just so there's something to look at, right? How are we doing on questions, guys? What do we have here? A couple InfoPath questions. A lot of interest in SharePoint Designer. You want to talk about Yammer for a minute, because Yammer's not obviously not something that requires code, and it's although it's not really a piece of SharePoint, it's kind of getting to that point. What are you guys' thoughts on Yammer?
It's a good complement to SharePoint, I think, at this point. It's sort of it's a cloud-based only service offering. So even if you're running SharePoint on premises, you still would be running Yammer in the cloud. It sits.
And by the way, can I should chime in? Yeah. If you don't know what Yammer is kind of, I guess you'd call it Facebook for SharePoint, or Facebook, for businesses, right? It's a social collaboration tool where people can kind of follow each other's feeds and all that kind of thing. Similar to other tools like NewsGator that have been around for SharePoint in the past and things like that. So go ahead, Marc. I just want to make sure people knew what Yammer was.
So what it really does is add an extra social layer on top of SharePoint, or next to, actually I should say next to. There are some integration points. You can put some web parts into SharePoint that expose what's going on in Yammer. But there's also some redundancy. That Yammer lets you store files, for instance, as the SharePoint, of course. So you need to really think about how the two of them fit together based on your requirements, and there are different ways that you can integrate them or keep them separate depending on what makes the most sense. You could, in fact, run a small business just on Yammer, and that would be fine, because, like I said, it has some really strong collaboration capabilities that may be enough for a small organization.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm going to throw something in there. Actually, I'm going to throw a question in there for the other panelists, and maybe for you, Jack, as well, if you've seen it. I personally don't see Yammer being utilized in any on-premises environment that I've seen. So if a company is not on SharePoint Online, not on Office 365, I've not seen anybody personally use it. Have you guys seen anything?
I haven't.
I had one client actually that was using Yammer pretty extensively before Microsoft bought them. Mm-hmm. And they were a SharePoint shop, so they were really using both of them long before they were ever used in the same sentence. But I think that is by far the exception. If you're keeping SharePoint on premises, you're probably not interested in Yammer because it's in the cloud.
That's what I've seen currently. Let's see what happens in the future.
Sure. Somebody asked a question. I thought this was a great question. It was kind of a code-based question. It was like, well, what other things besides jQuery and JavaScript and stuff should we know? And maybe this is, for that person, this might not be the right answer, but in general, there's so much that you can do with customizing SharePoint lists and views and filtering those views and lookup tables and things like that. There's so much stuff there that I wonder if the average developer skips past all that because it looks either maybe it's all kind of hidden, or maybe it looks like it's too simple or whatever. But using some filtered views and some web parts on a page and what have you, you can do an awful lot, I feel, within SharePoint, for day-to-day kind of stuff. And I think that while it might be basic for some, I think it might be easy to overlook for others, and that would definitely be something that's worth spending a little time and kind of poking around at what's under the hood there.
Well, that was something I was going to demonstrate if we have the time, and probably one of the most powerful and presentations that I do that is extremely well received is demonstrating identity-driven behavior on a SharePoint list or library.
Sure. What do you guys think? Do we have time for that? Do you have it up on your screen now, Ira? I can switch over if you...
Sure.
Okay.
If you get done in a couple of minutes, then let's do it.
Sure,
okay.
It'll take like 5 minutes. And this is, emblematic of exactly what you just spoke.
Okay. So I am going to try to switch this over. If the world stops spinning when I do this, then I apologize. I think this should be okay. All right. And it says we're waiting to view Ira's screen, and then it says we're viewing Ira's screen. And I see what looks like a Windows machine here. I think we're doing good.
Right. And you see a spreadsheet, okay?
I see a spreadsheet. Great. Take it away, Ira.
So this is a spreadsheet. This is actually a real instance that's been modified of a sales reporting spreadsheet that would go out to 100+ salespeople every month. And as you could see, it stores a lot of records. There's about 2,000 or 3,000 records. And you can see that there's roughly about 30 columns. And a lot of this column information, actually shouldn't be received by the salespeople every month. It should be a subset. And, number two is nothing here is identity driven. So, one salesperson sees all of the information about another salesperson. And that's not a great practice in any organization, but it actually happens everywhere. So what I'm going to demonstrate is I'm not going to actually demonstrate it, but I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the advanced steps, is that you can basically import this in as a SharePoint list. So there is a list function in SharePoint 2010-13 to import from an Excel spreadsheet, which is exactly what I did.
I'm guessing you have a chicken coming out of the oven already, Ira.
I got a chicken coming out of the oven right now. So basically, here is that very same list, brought into SharePoint, right? So it's like, okay, so what's the point of that? Now, some of the fields I eliminated, but, it's like, okay, so you can bring it into SharePoint, but so what? Okay, well, the so what is that you can easily, in a very few minutes, convert this to this. So now, notice here, this is a pane view, and I can hover all of the customers, and then what I do is I converted a horizontal-centric view into a vertical view of the particular information. And as you hover over each account, you see some important information, and you can do this any number of ways. And you can have multiple different views so that you can show, different order of information. But where you can really bring this that is extremely valuable and useful is that you can then, and by the way, notice here, this is what I want you to notice, is that notice here that as I hover over any one of these, I am seeing accounts where, the salesperson is Katie Jordan. Now, I'm Ira H. Fuchs when I log into SharePoint. And what I want is for this to happen. I want a view where I only see those accounts out of the 2,000, I only see the 150 where the salesperson is Ira Fuchs. And it gets that from, the logged in credentials here. So this is identity-driven behavior. It's creating a much nicer, vertical orientation of the information, but it is identity-driven. And the way this was done was exactly what you kind of described. I'm going to show you the technique very quickly. This list, and you can do this on a page, this list actually has two hidden embedded web parts on it in addition to the target list. It's got a current user filter, and it also has an identity reference list. So let me just show you. Let me restore the identity reference list. The identity reference list is just a generic SharePoint list that has identifying information about the individual. At a minimum, the most important piece is the alias. Okay, so here you've got an alias of Ira H. Fuchs. And what the current user filter does, and I'll just open up the web part and show you, the current user filter captures attributes from the user profile service. And I am capturing the username, which is the alias, the login alias Ira H. Fuchs. And that's all the current user filter does. It's hidden, but it captures that. And once I have captured that, I also placed this this list, which is the identity reference list, could actually have 500 different people. And what I did is I filtered it to only capture a single record for Ira H. Fuchs simply by setting up a connection where I send a filter, from the current user filter, and I filtered the identity reference list. And you can see that using the provider field name, current user, and I'm filtering that list on the alias value. And this way, I just get the record for Ira H. Fuchs. And then what I do is I filter the ultimate target to, I get the filter value. Let me just scroll down a little bit. So from the identity reference list, I grab the full name and I filter against the target list on the salesperson field. And that is the technique for doing identity-driven behavior on any list or library.
Ira, thank you so much.
that's a great example. I'm really glad you pulled it up because it shows that there are a bunch of capabilities that are right out of the box. I mean, you literally didn't write any code to do this.
And this is extremely useful and valuable. And it's even better because what you can do is go into SharePoint Designer, okay, put all three of those web parts on a separate page. So like I've got here, demo identity restricted. And then what you can do is right-click, copy. And you can only do this in SharePoint Designer by going into the site pages, copy, right-click, paste. I now have an identical web part page, and I'm going to preview in a browser. And what I can do with this page is I can actually change the permissions on the page itself, so it's completely different than the underlying library that we're pulling it from. And I can actually, if I want to keep the identity reference list and the user profile filter, but change the target list or library that I want to filter, so I don't have to do that three or four steps. I only have to do one step.
Sure. Hey, Ira, Carolyn in the chat room is asking if this can be done in SharePoint 2013.
Absolutely.
Obviously, this is 2010 that we're looking at here. And then what about on-premise versus online? Is it available online still?
You can do this online. You just have to know that the aliases online are a little complicated to capture, but it's pretty straightforward. Now, if you're interested...
And when you say the aliases, you mean the user ID that's up there? Okay, perfect.
Now, if anybody sends me an email, Fuchs@ihfpublishing.com, I will send you the chapter. That is a chapter in my SharePoint Cheat Thrills book, and I will send you the chapter on the technique of doing all of that.
Hey, that's great.
Okay, and if you really like that stuff and you want more, you can go to ihfpublishing.com, use Visual SP for the coupon code, and you can get a 40% discount, on any of these books. So the SharePoint Cheat Thrill books comes out at $14 after the discount. Anybody sends me an email, I will send them the chapter on what I just demonstrated with the fully documented steps.
I think the great thing about I love your books, Ira, but the other great thing about them is you take people through from the beginning of a solution to the end. I think that people need to realize that, because there are just an infinite number of solutions you could possibly build, these are great ways to just learn some steps along the way in building those sort of demo solutions that might help them in other ways with their actual solution. So, just because the exact solution that you want is not out there on the internet somewhere where you can copy and paste something, doesn't mean that you don't need to do your homework. I mean, looking at what you did here, I see about 12 different pieces of SharePoint functionality that I would say 90+% of people who use SharePoint don't know about. So just understanding what's there is part of the challenge.
And you know what? It's not different. And it's not difficult. It's stuff that you can do in like 30 minutes.
It's difficult for people whose minds don't sort of work that way. I find that usually there's somebody in every department who's really good at stuff like that, and it's often not the person you think it would be. It's just somebody who happens to sort of be able to break down problems into those pieces that you need to be able to solve it. So SharePoint is a collaborative platform, and you need to really do sort of collaborative development to be successful. And that's a way to sort of get away from having to write any code at all.
Speaking of not writing code, here's an article on TechNet, actually, and I'm going to send the link over the chat system to all the attendees if you want to copy and paste this on your own. No Code Solutions using SharePoint 2013 composites. Right now, what I think is pretty impressive here is look at how big of a list we've got here. I mean, there is a ton of stuff here. I mean, this isn't like, hey, you can do one or two things without code. I mean, this is huge. This is a lot of stuff. So I think this is pretty helpful there. We've got time for, I think, a couple more questions. Let me skim through, because I was actually, I hate to say it, I was watching Ira's demo and not paying attention to the chat room like I should have been. Let's see if there's anything here about no code solutions that we can answer. Can we get the names of the books that you showed earlier? that came up, I think, actually, again, just now. I think this question was before that. Carolyn, I think we've got those names, but if you didn't get them, ask another question at the end, and we'll make sure we put it up there. Asif, do you have those books' names, or Ira, do you want to just send them to, in the chat window, send them to the entire audience in the chat?
If they go to ihfpublishing.com, which is Ira's site, they'll see all the information.
That was this ihfpublishing right here.com, and that's the address there. So that answers that one.
Hey, somebody asked about what do we do with InfoPath right now? And I think that's a question that we kind of danced around. So let's go ahead and hit it quickly.
Sounds good.
Two different things that I hear all the time, and I'm sure you guys hear the same thing. One, we are already using InfoPath for a while. What do we do now? Second, we are considering going a form solution. What do we do right now? So what are your perspectives for both scenarios?
So if you're continuing to use, InfoPath on premise, continue doing so. If you do it online, continue doing so with the anticipation that it is going to go away. And there are actually a number of third-party products, either for just list view, that work with lists, or there is a very good product from a company called Clasis called AppForms, where you can really do some very sophisticated form applications. And somewhere down the line, the thing is with InfoPath, you can build a very quick, sophisticated form, in an hour, in a day, in 3 days. And at the end of the day, if you can build something in 3 days that solves a significant, application problem, and you're going to live with it for a year, then that's a deal. It's still a good deal.
Yeah, I agree. I hate to see it. I love InfoPath. I mean, it is such a flexible and good tool. I honestly don't really, it's like one of those things you could take it away, but you're going to take it away with me like holding on and, for dear life, right? So I do hope that, somewhere down the line, some clear winner, comes out so that we can all move forward. But
it's a shame. It's a shame that they haven't decided to just sort of fix whatever it is they needed to fix.
Sure.
And carry it forward as InfoPath 2015 or whatever.
Right.
I think that there are enough people who can do some tremendously good work with it that it really doesn't deserve to die so grisly a death.
Yeah, I agree.
That I answered. Actually, I put a link to a presentation that I did, which actually has a PowerPoint slide that was produced by Microsoft. In fact, Jack, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly show it on my screen.
Yeah, bring it over.
All right, here we go. Hopefully you can see it, or probably not. Here we go. Can you see it right now?
On my side, I haven't popped up yet. Here it is. Forms update from Microsoft. There we go.
Yep.
That's what Microsoft has showed, and I know Marc, and I'm sure, of course, Ira as well, and I've talked to them quite a bit about some of these things. But right now, honestly, some of these things are just, it's kind of in the cloud somewhere in somebody's mind. Some things are being processed, and there's not clear cut on every.
It's in their mind.
Platform stuff is already out, right? It's been out for a while. This stuff right here, that's Access. Great. This Word stuff, structured documents using Word plans at the end of 2014, that's already long gone, 2014. That hasn't happened. Forms on SharePoint lists had been working on it. There's been different things going on. I can't say anything specifically, but hopefully someday this will come out as well. The Excel surveys thing, that's already out. So these are the 4 different case scenarios that Microsoft took and said, you know what, we can provide these things right away, or at least some of these things right away and some of them in the future to replace some of the functionality or scenarios that are accomplished with InfoPath.
Yeah, unfortunately, the two that are out there, Excel surveys and app forms, are sort of the two extremes of the spectrum. And the meat of the market is really in list form. So hopefully we're going to see something there sooner rather than later.
I agree. I think we're almost out of time here, folks. So do we have a winner picked out from the chat room yet?
We do.
Okay.
Can I go ahead and announce it?
I'll go
ahead and announce that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The person's name, Lisa Smith. So
Yay, Lisa!
Lisa, if you could go ahead and email us. Actually, what I'll do is I'll throw in our email address as well. I'll just throw it to everybody, and we'll get you set up. Congratulations, Lisa. 1-year access to SharePointVideos.com or VisualSP.com.
And I just wanted to, again, thank everybody for coming. And also, I know the print's kind of small. Marc is at SYMPMARC with a C. Ira, he's still holding out on Twitter. He wants to see if it's going to be a fad or not. So he doesn't have a Twitter account yet. Asif is ASIFREHMANI. And I'm at SharePoint Jack. If you have questions that didn't get answered today, we saw as many of them as we could. I think we had, I don't even know if there's a count here, hundreds of them, right? Shoot us something over Twitter. I'll do everything I can to help you out or to direct you to somebody that might be an expert in that area. And I don't think that the learning has to end just because the webinar is ending. So we'd look forward to hearing from all of you down the road. Thank you, everyone, so much for attending. And we really appreciate your support of the webinar.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
You bet.
Bye now.
Bye.
This concludes the webinar, everybody. Thanks again for attending. My name is Jack Fruh, SharePoint Jack, and we've had on the panel Marc Anderson, Ira Fuchs, and Asif Rehmani. The seminar was called No Code Solutions for SharePoint 2013.